This is Akashvani. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on the significance of leaders session of the third Voice of Global South Summit. The participants are Professor Harsh V. Pant, Strategic Analyst, and Vaibhav Srivastav, Anchor.
India has been carefully, consistently, and in the spirit of camaraderie taking strides towards security management as well as sustainability. It has truly emerged as a believer of the concept of one world, one future. And be it human assistance and disaster relief, technology transfers, food security, or medical needs, India has always been there to assist its allied nations as a selfless and responsible leader. So, what is the Voice of Global South Summit? If you could please explain it to our listeners, its historical significance, and in the dynamic situation of the world order, why and how has it become such an important global grouping?
Traditionally, India has always been articulating the aspirations, the challenges, the hopes of a large number of countries that are often marginal in global discourse. So, the developing world, Global South as called now, is a grouping which is very, very critical in terms of the challenges that the world is facing today, and particularly at a time of geopolitical contestation that we are witnessing. Their voices are not present at important global platforms. I think has tried to do over the last few years is to articulate that voice much more robustly on the global stage. And in that context, we have seen the emergence of this platform, the Voice of the Global South Summit, which India had been now conducting since last year. And in some ways, the two summits that India hosted, the Voice of the Global South Summit in second iteration last year, they fed into India's own agenda of G20. So in some ways, what India has been telling its interlocutors in the Global South is that since their voices are not as present on the global platform, on the global stage, as perhaps they should be, India can amplify those voices because India today stands in solidarity with those voices, with those nations. And that's what India has been trying to do over the last few years in amplifying the voice of the global south on the global stage, whether it is in terms of the conflicts that we are witnessing, whether in terms of the challenges pertaining to energy and food security, climate security, or whether it is in terms of the socio-economic upheaval that is happening as a result of economic transformation that the world is going through. So enormous challenges, but I think also enormous opportunities for the global south, which India feels by bringing together these various countries from the global south on one platform, India can help mobilize these voices, amplify those voices, so that the world's attention, the global governance agenda, can feature those concerns as the world takes global governance forward. In a nutshell, what we are witnessing through these initiatives pertaining to Global South that India has taken, and the Voice of the Global South Summit has become a very important part of the global calendar now that India continues to invest in this, and the Global South also feels that they are part of how the global governance agenda is being shaped out.
So recently, during the Honorable President Srimati Draupadi Murmu's visit to the islands of Fiji, the nations of Timor-Leste and New Zealand, it was said that these nations believe that India will be a true leader, especially when it comes to climate justice. We also know that India's role has been continuously changing in the new world order. Why do you think India has been continuously gaining the trust of the global south, and how has it emerged as a true bridge between the developing and the developed world?
I think what India has been telling all sides global order is that unless we bring global governance agenda closer to the aspirations of the developing world, we will not be able to articulate a sustainable global governance agenda. And that is exactly where a lot of the countries, for example, that you mentioned, the island countries, or whether they are the developing countries in Asia and Africa, or whether they are small island states across the maritime landscape, Indian Ocean and Pacific. I think all of these countries have very real-time challenges that they face, and particularly on the environmental side. If you look at the small island states, foremost security challenge is the environmental landscape that is changing rapidly, and how that the climate change agenda is one of the most important agendas that they want to be the world to invest in. But what is unfortunately what is also happening is precisely at the time that the global governance agenda needs to be forward-looking, we are seeing a crumbling of the multilateral order. And that is a very important point. And that is something that, again, we have seen India articulate repeatedly, that the global governance architecture that was created at the end of the Second World War no longer responds to the challenges of our time. Because the world has changed, the world's aspirations have changed, the balance of power in the world has changed, and therefore that those countries that were determining the global governance agenda in, say, 1945, no longer hold key positions, no longer are either willing or able to take forward the global governance agenda. And therefore, the focus of a large part of the world is on those countries who can take their aspirations and their challenges and frame a global governance agenda which is responsive to their aspirations. And that is why India becomes a very important actor. India has emerged as a very important actor because India is in some ways a country that is beyond the geopolitical contestation that is shaping up. India is one of the few countries that still has good relations with the developed world, that still can articulate the aspirations of the developing world, that continues to have engagements across the world. We have seen, for example, in the two major conflicts that the world is witnessing, the Russia-Ukraine war and the crisis in the Middle East. If you look at the stakeholders in these conflicts, India has good ties with both sides. So Prime Minister Modi went to Moscow recently, and now he's going to Ukraine, in a sense articulating this view from the global south that these conflicts need to come to an end because the brunt of these conflicts is being borne by the developing world. Because in terms of their economy, in terms of their energy security, in terms of the lack of focus on the climate agenda that perhaps many of these countries feel very strongly about. And therefore, that's the reason why India continues to generate this kind of support, this kind of confidence, which is unlike many other countries. They may be big powers, but they don't have the confidence of a large part of these countries because many of the developing world, many members of the global south believe that the bigger countries, the major powers are increasingly only catering to their own interests and are becoming more and more inward looking. And I think what happened during COVID, for example, exemplified this trend when, unlike the developed world and unlike, say, countries like China, India was one of the few countries that articulated a globalist agenda, where India was willing to share its pharmaceuticals, its vaccines, its expertise in medicine with a large part of the world which no one else was bothered about. And I think that has generated a new confidence in the developing world that India perhaps can take the lead in amplifying their voices, in amplifying or in shaping the global governance agenda, which can respond to their challenges.
So, on one hand, as you had just mentioned, that the established order or the countries which were deciding the governance on the world platform have had many conflicts on an international level. And on the other hand, India has been consistently pushing towards becoming an IT hub, a defense hub, a manufacturing hub, which also gives a sense of security to its ally nations that India can provide for their needs even if the West or the other developed countries do not come forward for their help. Do you feel that this assurance has been a very important factor in taking India's place up, especially amongst the nations or the committee of the nations of the global south? And where does the West stand on it?
There was a time, for example, during the Cold War, when India used to speak about the so-called third world. Now, but at that point in time, India did not have the capabilities. India was not the fastest growing economy in the world. India was not an economic exemplar. India was not seen as a country that can actually mobilize support from across various blocks. Today, things look quite different. As you mentioned, today the confidence that the developing world has on India comes from the fact that India not only is taking the lead in shaping global governance narrative, but India increasingly is also capable of ensuring that some of these initiatives actually see the light of the day. India actually today is the fastest growing economy in the world. India has consistently been moving up the economic ladder. So India has emerged as an exemplar that even a country which is democratic, which is multicultural, multi-ethnic, can still become an exemplar in the world by doing well economically. It seemed as if the only option is that if you want to do well economically, you have to be an autocratic state like China. Now, India is shattering that myth that you can be a democracy and yet you can do well economically. And also, by being all of that, India can shape global governance agenda. So there is a degree of confidence about India and about India's abilities which did not exist before. And that, I think, is a very important part of the way the landscape has changed, and India has been able to generate that confidence. And the world, therefore, looks at India with a very different set of lenses than it used to in the past, which means that the responsibility that India has today also becomes larger. And therefore, we are seeing these kinds of initiatives like the Voice of the Global South Summit, for example. India takes these very seriously. In fact, India's G20 agenda was driven by the fact that at a time when the world is getting more and more contested geopolitically and geoeconomically, India can bring the world together on global governance issues. And it therefore India's G20 agenda was shaped by the two Voice of the Global South summits that India hosted last year. And India has continued to take that forward. I think one of the takeaways from India's G20 summit was that India will continue to take a lead in conducting these Voice of the Global South summit, and therefore will continue to generate a global governance agenda in which the developing world will have a great voice. And let's not forget that it was under India's presidency that African Union became a member of the G20. Africa being such an important part of the developing world, and its voice was not reflected on the global platforms. So in that sense, I think there is a great degree of confidence that now India can not only talk, but also walk that talk. And I think that is becoming a very important part, the narrative around India's rise and the confidence that a large part of the world has on India to take leadership on global governance issues, where there's something, an area which was lacking in the past. Today there is that confidence, and that comes also with the fact that unlike, say, a country like China, India enjoys great ties with the developed world, with the Western world. India is not in a contested space as far as the West is concerned. India wants to bring the developed and the developing countries together to sharpen, to frame global governance agenda that can serve all. And when India says Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, it means Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam.
So for all our listeners, could you please explain how important it is, the policy level coordination between the various ministries that happen, after which there are various presentations given by the union ministers during this summit, and how does it shape the foreign policy of India? Let's say we are not just providing for ourselves but also for a large part of the world. How do these ministers think among themselves or contemplate about various issues, and how does it then change India's actions, or, as you said, walking the talk about various issues that India has promised?
I think one of the changes we have seen in the last few years is what I think the Modi government, and particularly Prime Minister Modi, have been able to do, is to tell India that, or to tell Indian citizens that foreign policy is not something that is primarily elite driven. It is something where democratic participation is needed, and it is something where all parts of government will have to work together to ensure that India's voice and India's stature and India's salience in the global order is seen the way it should be seen. And I think that is why when you see the agenda of the, for example, Voice of the Global South Summit, it involves key ministers making presentations. Ministerial sessions are there where all key ministries are articulating what those ministries are doing, not only for India, but for the wider world. So it can be, for example, how DPI, for example, digital public infrastructure, India is sharing its own successes with the wider world. It can be how India is sharing the infrastructure success with the wider world. It can be how India is sharing its climate success with the wider world. So you have different ministries coming from different vantage points, telling its own governance story to the wider world and sharing its best practices with the wider world. So it becomes also a governance exercise that what India has been able to accomplish, India is today confident enough to share it with the developing world and make them a partner in its developmental journey. And that, I think, makes this phase particularly very, very important, this structure very, very important, where it is not simply the leaders of these countries talking. It is not simply Prime Minister who speaks at the summit and articulates a vision. It is also the ministers who come after Prime Minister in their sessions, who tell the world, who tell particularly the developing world, their own contribution, their own action plan for their own ministries, and therefore share the best practices with the developing world. And I think that is a very interesting way in which New Delhi is today trying to sharpen the leverage that it has in global politics. Now, how far it will yield dividends, of course, depends on the receptivity in the global south. But certainly at this moment, whatever we have heard in these summits, there is a lot of attention being paid to India's best practices, to Indian governance structures, and there is a lot of attention that is being placed in India's leadership style.
Sir, thank you so much for making this discussion enriched with your valuable insights and explaining such complex issues in such a lucid manner. Thank you so much for giving your precious time to Akashvani.
Thank you so much.
You were listening to a discussion on the significance of leaders session of the Third Voice of Global South Summit. The participants were Professor Harsh V. Pant, Strategic Analyst, and Vaibhav Srivastav, Anchor. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of Akashvani. You can listen to it on our mobile app News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel News on AIR Official. You may share your feedback about this program through email at airnsttalks@gmail.com.
ये आकाशवाणी का